Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. One of my favorite baits to use is a jig, and I wanted to break down how important it is to understand all the different aspects to a jig. We're going to deconstruct the jig to give you guys a full understanding as to how every minute little change on the jig affects the performance of it, and how some jigs are made more for rocks, some are made for grass, some are made for wood. There's a lot that goes into a jig that separates them from other jigs. A jig is not just a jig, which is something I hear quite frequently from a lot of anglers out there. They just feel like, well, I picked out a half-ounce jig and I went and I cast it around or I flipped it around. The reality is it may really be hindering their performance if they're not choosing the correct jig. So we're going to kind of break down the different components on a jig and give you a full understanding as to where and when you should be choosing certain jigs. Before I get into that, though, I do want to remind you that if I do offer the lake breakdowns now, so if you're looking for a little bit of help on some of your local lakes, check out the lake breakdowns that I do through fishthemoment.com. I'll put the link in the video description for that. All right, so the first and most obvious aspect to a jig is the head design. What is the shape of the head? And you've got a lot of different types of jigs. You got your football jigs like this wart head. You've got your casting jigs or your flipping jigs. This is a hog snatcher. You've got your swim jigs like this guy right here. All jigs really are defined by the head of the bait more than anything else. So with your swim jigs, you generally have more of a bullet-shaped head with a line tie that is parallel to the hook point. And it's really about getting that bait to come through cover nice and smooth and allow that bait to swim very freely. And there's more that goes into that, and I'll get into it. But based on just head design alone, swim jigs are going to be more of a bullet-shaped head. Your flipping jigs are going to be a lot more of a kind of a combination between a bullet head and more of your archy style head, I guess is what I would say. It's made to come through cover, but at the same time, it's made to get down into cover. And then you've got your dragging baits, which are much more like your football head designs. But the shape of the head really does come into play quite a bit. And I know that's very basic, but I think it's really important for people to recognize the shape of the head and how it's going to come through cover. Your bullet shapes are definitely going to come through grass better. Your wider football head styles are going to be made for more dragging. Everything in between there is kind of in the middle. It'll just come through the rock, the wood, the grass in different manners. Now, I will also say one other key component is if you're looking to skip a jig around, you want to see what does the bottom of that bait look like. Is it got a little bit more flat space to it, or is it bigger and wider? Generally, you want a bait that's going to be able to skip better than one that's not going to necessarily skip as good, like a football jig. The next most important thing to look at, in my opinion, is your line tie. Is your line tie perpendicular, which means it's perpendicular to your hook point, or is it parallel to your hook point? So if you're looking to fish around grass, you're probably better off choosing a bait that's going to be parallel. And that really helps bring the bait through that grass. You don't get nearly as much cut grass or grass strands that get caught around that as you would a perpendicular line tie. A perpendicular line tie, though, really shines around rock and wood. It just helps bring that bait up over the wood versus hitting the wood and generally wanting to rock to either side, which makes you get snagged more. So if you're flipping around a lot of wood, a lot of stumps, your perpendicular line ties are going to be better than your parallel line ties. If you're swimming a bait through grass and generally, in my opinion, skipping it up under docks, a parallel line tie is generally better. You also want to look at your composition of the head. Now, there's a bunch of different types of material used to make jig heads these days. For the most part, the two most common, traditional lead head, and then you've got a lot of tungsten jigs now that are coming out on the market. A tungsten jig, for me, really shines for two reasons. One, it's a more compact head design, which gives the bait a little bit more of a natural presentation. But more importantly, it's harder, and if you're fishing around rock, it gives off a much different sound than lead. Lead is more of a dull thump. Your tungsten is more of like a pinging sound. It's a higher pitch sound. So for me, if I'm fishing rock, I'm almost always going to be fishing tungsten. If I'm fishing a soft bottom area, there's really no difference between tungsten and lead, in my opinion, other than the smaller head profile. Um, but you still want to be really aware of the composition of that head. Another big difference with jigs comes down to your weed guard. One thing I really like about the Picasso ones is they've got these titanium wire weed guards that have like a little drip of epoxy on it, and they work extremely well. They always spring right back into position. And that's kind of a unique product that they have. But there's a lot of different types of weed guards. One that we use on our core tackle jigs, we just like a single wire weed guard. But then you've got the traditional bristle weed guards. So you've kind of got here three different styles. You got, this hybrid multi-strand titanium weed guard. You've got a single strand wire weed guard, and then you've got your bristle. And they've all got a place. If you're spending a lot of time flipping around wood and really heavy cover, your bristle weed guard is going to be the best in terms of coming through cover. The problem with a bristle weed guard is there's a lot of material there, and that material can prevent you from hooking up with fish. It also, in my opinion, gives the least lifelike appearance, and if your bait has any motion at all, it really limits the motion of the bait. That's the main reason why we prefer to throw on the core tackle a single wire weed guard. There's way less resistance by one single wire weed guard than you'd have with a whole lot of bristles. So if you're looking for a bait that's got movement like a swim jig, I really like a single wire weed guard because I think you get better hookups and you get much better rolling action because you don't have a bristle weed guard that's preventing that rolling action. But if I'm dragging a bait or flipping a bait, I'm generally not looking for that rolling action. And then you've got, kind of your hybrid here, which is going to give you better weedlessness because you've got more strands that protect the hook, and you still get a good lifelike appearance because you don't have all of those bristles. So a lot of it really comes down to what you're fishing. If you're fishing really heavy cover, I think a bristle weed guard is the best in terms of preventing hangups. If you're fishing really clear water or you're fishing a moving bait, a wire weed guard, in my personal preference, I think is going to get you more bites. So that's another major feature that I think really goes overlooked on jigs themselves is the weed guard. And then you've got to look at, your skirt. So skirts to me are one of those things that are very, very much overlooked by anglers, and they can drastically impact the action of your bait. Most skirts will come with a certain strand count based on the skirt manufacturer's abilities, meaning, as much as I would like to say, hey, I want 2 strands of orange, 1 strand of this, blah, 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 you're not going to be able to do that at a mass-produced level. The companies that make the skirts are going to say, hey, you got to give me, a lot of them will say, it's by tab. So a tab is a strip of plastic that's generally got about 16 to, it depends on the company, but 16 to 20 strands of material. The thing is, if you want to put 3 colors into a skirt, well, then you're using 3 full tabs. 3 full tabs is a lot of material. So some jigs out there will have really bulky skirts, which may not be a bad thing from a look or an appearance standpoint, but if you're looking for a lot of movement out of your jig skirt, you're not going to get it. The more material you've got in your jig skirt, the less undulation you get. So for me, a lot of times I end up actually cutting out a huge amount of the material just to be able to get the skirt to flow. Now, if I'm fishing really muddy water or it's really cold water and I want a really slow fall, those big thick skirts come in handy for that because the more skirt material slows the fall of your jig and it creates a bigger, bulkier profile. But if I'm fishing summer months in really clear water and I want a fast fall, I'll trim out potentially up to 2/3 of the material and just leave really a small amount of material that's there. And I find that to be very, very effective. The other main thing with skirts that you want to look at, most of the time when you get a skirt right out of the box, like this one right here, they have a lot of longer material. I personally like to trim my skirt so that it's roughly about a half inch below the hook bend. In this case, there's skirt material that's probably about an inch and a half below it, if not a little bit more. And the biggest issue with that is depending on the trailer you choose, those long materials can limit the trailer's motion. So if you've got a trailer with flapper motion in it, those strands will actually catch the flapper and completely stop it from flapping. You know, if you're throwing something like a chunk style like this, it's not nearly as important. But if you want to throw something like a swim jig, you know, that's got a boot tail, it'll stop the boot tail from kicking. If you want to throw something like that little pit boss, it will stop these little kicker tails from moving. All of those come into play, and there is no perfect jig out there. You need to take into account your watercolor, the depth that you're fishing, the cover that you're fishing, the water temperature, all of these different things to really figure out how to identify the jig that will be most productive for you on that trip. And one jig that might work in the summer on a certain body of water may not be the right jig in the fall or the winter on the same body of water in the same area. So it's just something to be aware of. But it really frustrates me when I hear people just say, well, a jig is a jig. I've got, you know, I own 10 jigs of, you know, one brand and that's all I need. And it's like, it's not that simple. There's a lot more that goes into this, in my opinion. Um, and the more you know about jig selection, the more you're going to be able to apply that on the water to give yourself an advantage so that maybe it gets you an extra 1 or 2 bites on a trip, which can lead to a lot of additional fish throughout the year. Anyways, let me know what you guys think. If you like this type of video, I can basically do this with every bait type out there, because there really is a lot that goes into every type of lure category on the market. So let me know, guys. Otherwise, I appreciate you all watching. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.